one of my universities with a master's class. And I think I made them divide into pairs, and I gave them 3 reflective questions to ask each other. It was a 10-minute exercise. You know, a lot of them came out of that and said, look, I've known this person for 3 years and I found out more about them in 10 minutes.
So what were the 3 questions?
I can't remember.
Okay. I was about to take notes.
I know. It's very sad that I can't remember. But I have done a lot of workshops over the years with people, just helping them brainstorm reflective ways of relating. And it's something, I mean, even if someone asks you a question, this is so really primitive, Don, supervisors often say to me, how do I draw people out in supervision? Because if I ask them how they are, they just say, I'm fine. So we brainstorm. How can you ask them a question that helps them reflect?
Let's just talk about that for a second, because we live in a crazy time where we gauge conversations by sound bites or by video clips or by characters, and fine is kind of the catch-all phrase for everything, because we're either afraid to go deeper, or we don't have the time, or we don't want you to know. We want to be private. It seems to me, to your point, that if we can find the right question presented the right way, that we can break some of those barriers.
Yeah, and look, sometimes it mightn't be even asking a question. Sometimes I get people to think about what is the kind of scenario, climate they're trying to set up. So it might be, so with a supervision session, for instance, they often come up with saying, oh, well, I could just ask them to tell me about their week. So often telling a story is much easier than answering a question. So that, that seems almost trite, doesn't it? But actually that tends to work more easily to people. Or tell me about something which happened to you this week that you're puzzled about. That kind of thing. So you're inviting them to engage with you in a different kind of a way. Also, like in supervision, or often even between friends, a friend might ask, what should I do about blah? And, of course, you get flattered because they're asking you what they should do. So you try to tell them. The reflective way is to actually plumb through why they're asking. What's that about? So, I wonder why you're asking. Are you worried about blah? These are good counselling sorts of techniques anyway, Don, so they're not rocket science. But it's about putting yourself in the mindset that you're actually trying to find out about the person and understand their situation in depth, rather than feeling that you have to respond with an answer or show like you know something, or, be in that kind of, I don't know, in a conversation. I suppose it's more of a antagonist sort of position, rather than just being alongside the person and trying to understand what they're on about. What does that mean for you? No,
I was just going to say, there was a time when I could fix everything, or I thought I could fix everything. And somewhere there was a transition where I stopped, or I realized I couldn't fix everything or much at all, but I could ask different questions. And, probably a narrative that happens a lot these days is in the news, where people will talk about a particular story, and it's easy to ask, well, why do you feel that way? Or to go at the questions and to try and help understand, their interpretation of a particular issue. But that, I don't know whether that happens at an earlier age or a later age, or it just happens, somewhere in the journey.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because I have met people who I would say are more naturally reflective, and they're all different ages.
Okay.
I love to know how people get like that naturally. I've no idea. But I think we do challenge the assumption that you have to know everything, or that you have to have the answers, because there's a power dynamic there, isn't there? So it is about kind of deconstructing that power dynamic. And I think just feeling comfortable with being alongside someone, whoever they are. And that takes practice. especially for professionals who are kind of bad at that because they think they're supposed to have the answers.
I sometimes say that I'm looking for the Buddha within so I can let go of all those assumptions and be open to the universe. But that can be a bit eclectic.
Well, I would say yes and no to that. I think the issue is we probably always have assumptions. So the first step is knowing what they are before you can let go of them. And I do actually think it's very hard for people to do this, which is kind of why I developed my model, because I just realised people needed practice. It did not come naturally. It's not a natural Western way of thinking about things, and it is unorthodox in an academic setting, because we don't even like to talk about personal experience in an academic setting.
You're listening to the Conversation Lab. My name is Don Schaefer, and we're speaking with Jan Fook. Speak more to the work.
The critical reflection work?
Yeah. Or the model.
The model. Okay. We start with what I call the critical incident, which is that description of an event. And we do it I tend to do it in small groups, 5 to 10. And in that group, each person will have an opportunity to present their incident to the group, and then the group will help them reflect. Okay. Now, I usually start with an introduction so that everybody understands the basic principles we're using, like being non-judgmental, for instance. We're not trying to affirm what the person did. We're just trying to help them dig beneath, and that takes practice. So usually in that first stage, the group will just ask a whole range of questions which are designed to help the person get at the assumptions underneath. So it'd be questions like I said to you then, I wonder where that came from. What do you think the crux of the matter was? So we're trying to get to the really central and fundamental meaning of it for people. Now, I'm going to get a bit tricky here and say that's what we would call it if we were using a more of a spirituality kind of framework. If we're using a deconstructive framework, we would just say we're trying to deconstruct what this was for you. Okay, if we're being reflexive, we might say, well, we're trying to get you to understand what your own influence was on the situation. Okay, so it can be theorised many ways. So that's what we do in stage 1, and I do have a whole list of questions that I help people practice with so that they can help elicit what's underneath rather than kind of close the person down or impose their own views. So there might be other questions like, I wonder what your own role was. How do you think you influenced the situation? I wonder if there's any patterns in the words that you use. So this is a more deconstructive question. And what do those patterns say about what you were assuming? So, there's actually literally hundreds of different questions that can be worded in different ways. But the questions are designed, in the end of the day, to help that person who's reflecting understand the fundamental assumptions and meaning of what that experience meant to them.
Those questions begin to feel uncomfortable because they strike an emotional chord, which is what they're supposed to do. Are they enough to get someone who's stuck on something, who's stuck on an issue or stuck on a belief, to move their position?
Normally, yes. I'd say in about 90% of situations, yes, but sometimes no. This is partly the role of the facilitator to try to find ways of questioning that help the person find a way through. But sometimes, the incidents that people are talking about are too traumatic or whatever. And I wouldn't actually want them to go into that depth anyway in critical reflection, because it's not meant to be therapy. So when I ask people to bring an incident, I do ask them to bring something that they're okay with presenting to the whole group. But yes, occasionally I get people who bring situations which are probably more appropriately dealt with in therapy. But because it's really important to them, they bring it. And we do deal with it. But yes, people get stuck. I've had an instance of someone who had experienced a lot of abuse and really could not get out of that framework. I think although the whole group could see it, we could not ask questions enough in a way that helped her recognise that. Having said that, after she finished that first stage and went away and did the second stage, she realised it herself because she kept reflecting. But yes, it doesn't work always in that first stage, and in order to be ethical, I try to ensure that people don't feel they have to divulge absolutely everything, because it can be emotionally traumatic. So we draw up rules to say, well, people can draw limits if they want. But I've also had people who've realised there's something else going on for them. They don't divulge it at the time, but they go away and they think about it further, and it becomes meaningful then in private, and that's absolutely fine. But yeah, the emotional side, and I always say the emotions must be part of it because it's an important part of the learning, and the emotions are a flag often for what is important in terms of what they're assuming. But I try to draw it back to assumptions to just take the edge off the emotional side sometimes, because being emotionally distressed or open or vulnerable is not the best way of learning for everyone, for all kinds of reasons. So I do try to kind of draw it back to assumptions so it stays a little bit more on that cognitive level. But it's always intertwined, honestly, Don, always.
I'm just thinking about what's happening in the world around us and how divided we seem to be, how many different camps there are, or how many different values and beliefs there are about different things. We're not the U.S. Canada has its own issues, but we certainly have our own issues. And racism is alive and well in Canada as it is, around the world. I'm just trying to think about those people that are so stuck in their values and beliefs that they won't change. Do we all eventually change, whether it's a kind and gentler way doing self-reflection, or does it take a life-changing event to change?
Well, if I go back to John Dewey, I suppose he would say reflection is learning from experience. So the question is, do we all learn from experience, and do we all learn good things? When you ask a question like that, I try to imagine having Donald Trump in one of my workshops. And I'm imagining it's not going to work with him, right? So I do think you have to have a preparedness for this, and probably the right kind of personality makeup as well. But most of those things we would expect would be present, say, in anyone who goes into higher education, for instance, and certainly should be present in anyone who wants to do social work. But it's not always the case. I don't think people learn to reflect naturally, frankly. I think it is partly a cultural thing, well, very much a cultural thing. I think it's a gendered thing quite often. And what I have found is that people do need to be taught how to reflect. Even if they're naturally reflective people, they may not always be aware of how, when and why they're being reflective. So if you want to become more reflective, you do need to understand what that is. So, yeah, it would be nice to think we all got there naturally, but we don't. As world wars and so forth, any wars will indicate. And I think the issues around race and racism are a fantastic case in point because it's so divisive, very divisive, and in any debate you're usually forced to take sides, which then silences any kind of nuance or silences different perspectives. I must actually send you a reference, because do you know Stephen Brookfield's work?
No.
Okay, no. So he's actually a British academic, but he's been in the US. He's working on a book on critical